So here we are down in Seattle with Angus Trim. Angus, tell our viewers a little bit about what you
do. Make swords.
Make swords, good answer. Okay, so briefly describe what goes into making a sword. I mean, a lot of people love using the end product, but they don't really know what goes into it, or they just imagine pouring molten metal into some rock. And
now, you do understand that I'm a little unconventional the way I make swords, right?
Okay, yeah.
So if I would describe it, it's going to be what I do, not what most sword makers do.
Whatever you have for us is great.
All right. I start out. I order the material. A few days later, the material truck comes in, unload the material. The material goes to the heat treater to be sub-annealed, so it's machinable. When it gets back here, I set it up in that CNC mill over on the far side there, and using the green button, the red button, machine the blades. They go back to heat treat, and here's the hardening process, and the blade is now as hard as it's going to get after tempering. Then it needs to be ground, and this is where things like the appearance of the blade, edge geometry, finishing up the distal taper, stuff like that happens. That takes care of the blade. Guard has to be machined, fitted to the tang, ground into shape, and then I heat blue those. That's why they're bluish black. That's that in the pommel. Also heat blued are done that way to prevent corrosion, to make corrosion a little more difficult. The handles I actually machine the slots in the same mill, and they get glued to, two pieces. They get glued together and ground over on the grinders you saw as you walked in.
Yep.
And then the fun part happens. The grinding of the actual making of the handle is fairly easy. It's the wrapping the handle and making that look really good, which is the difficult part. The wood is wrapped with cotton cord. And then Eric, blacksmith, a guy that actually does the leather wrapping, will wrap the leather over the cord, and then, just like Albion does, gets counter wrapped so that you get that bug out look on the handle. Assembly of the sword is a little bit different depending on the individual sword. Since I grind the tangs, they're not necessarily going to be exactly the same. Some of the guards have to be hammered on. Some of them actually fit moderately loosely. If they're loose, then I bond them to the blade so that they won't move. The handles almost universally have to be hammered on the last inch. And then the pommel is fitted on top of that. So if there's a little bit of movement, you hold it straight, and then I use a nut, a pommel nut, to hold it in place. The pommel nut at the end of that is eventually ground off. It becomes a permanent assembly. The nut is intended to look like a peen. It is not a true peen. It's a nut. That's basically what I do.
Fantastic. Okay. What got you interested in swords in the first place?
Oh, God, that happened 50 some odd years ago. Watching various movies and getting kind of fascinated. What did it recently, more or less recently, I got involved in Tai Chi with my wife and stumbled into weapons training. And absolutely fell in love with the movement that one does working with the sword. And the Jin is actually pretty similar in appearance to a medieval sword. It just, and of course, being a machinist, and knowing that I could make this stuff, it just kind of fell into place. And I'm an obsessive kind of individual, so once I got going on it, it just rolled.
Fantastic. Okay. What would you say is the most interesting thing that you've learned about swords in your time making them?
Oh, geez.
Or interesting, or something that people might not realize about swords?
That's a tough one. That proper balance isn't what a lot of people think. Proper balance doesn't mean that while you're sitting in your armchair that it feels real light in the hand. That proper balance has to do with every part of the sword's motion and how it handles in the cut. And you get very little feedback to the handle as you're cutting things. It's the whole thing. Because as a young man, I thought balance was like a lot of new people do. You hold it out. Oh God, this feels good. No, it's how the sword moves. It's key to the sword.
All right. What's the most interesting sword project you've ever worked on or built?
The single-edged swords with two-hand capability. Two-handed falchions. Since they're not symmetrical, they have some issues when you're making them. Like they warp fairly easily in heat treat. The handling balance is a little bit different. The way they handle in the cut is a little bit different. Like I said, you can warp them. So how you approach it from the hilt down is a little bit different. It's a different rule set, I guess is the way to put it.
Interesting. All right. Do you have any, say, tips or something? Someone who wants to start out, maybe making blades just recreationally for themselves. Some people have a passion for that, but they've never gotten into it.
Yeah. Today, there's an awful lot of photos on the internet of various antiques. You can now get specifications off the internet, like how thick a blade is at the base, the amount of distal taper, the width, blade length, weight of the sword. I would go out of my way to learn that before actually worrying about trying to make a sword. Learn what a sword is before you actually go to making one.
All right, really quickly, can you describe distal taper when you're at it? Because it's not a term that most people will be familiar with.
Distal taper is how the blade thins from the cross down towards the tip. In other words, like that sword you guys brought, it's roughly 5 millimeters thick at the base, and the taper will thin to just behind the point to roughly 2 millimeters. And it does that in a linear fashion. By linear fashion, I mean that everywhere you measure it, if you measure it every 5 inches along the blade, the thickness, that should be roughly the same all the way down. The difference should be roughly the same. So let's say the difference is 1/10 of a millimeter in 5 inches. It should be that all the way down the blade.
All right. Let's say you're looking at buying a sword for yourself because no one likes to use their own work because they're too critical.
Okay.
What type of things do you like in swords, and what do you look for?
I looked at it's almost a spiritual thing. I look for something how the sword moves in my hand. When I'm moving my body with the sword in hand, does it feel natural? Can I feel the point as I'm moving it? Does the various movements that you do, say in your drills, is it natural with that sword? That's more important to me than the exact weight, the appearance, and really just about anything else I can think of right now. How that sword moves.
What's your favorite type of sword?
Sword and buckler. So that actually encompasses more than one type of sword, but a sword and buckler is a fairly light, really quick, single-handed sword. Yeah, that's what I like.
How often have you ever cut yourself while making swords?
Weekly.